The Prime Minister needs to stop bulldozing and start negotiating with the Greens to fix the housing and rental crisis.
I mean, what is going on with the Albanese government? Every decision they take turns out to be a disaster.
In some cases, it's just immaturity and spite from the Greens spokesperson who says he supports more housing but never will vote for it. And in the Liberals and Nationals case, they're just blockers.
The political battle lines have been getting sharper this week, in fact positively pointy. And the main battlefield has been the Senate.
You are the worst government we've ever seen. This is the filth, the absolute filth that is taking out veterans. And the filth still continues.
The Albanese government cannot even execute a strategy to have one of its own bills defeated. It certainly can't manage to get its bill passed, but it's now not even managing to find a strategy or a means to have its bill defeated either.
This is an absolutely disgraceful attack on young people, on people who want to buy their own home, and the guilty parties are right there before us.
Can you make a concrete commitment that Labor will not scrap or amend negative gearing in order to secure support for a minority government with the Greens?
We've seen on housing the member for Griffith lead you down a path which heads him lock in step with Peter Dutton. They're like arm in arm, wandering, I don't know, what is one of the streets in Brisbane. That's what they're doing.
The government had deliberately scheduled a Senate-only week and seemed happy to try to use the widely expected brawls over legislation, particularly Labor's long-stalled housing measures, to focus voters' minds on how the combined forces of the Coalition and Greens have been blocking its agenda. The government didn't just want to maximise pressure on other parties in the crossbench to pass legislation which it says will help ease the housing crisis. It wanted to focus voters' minds on how the Greens behave in the Parliament, ahead of an election which many analysts believe will produce a minority government. Labor wants to make sure voters, even those frustrated with its agenda in the current term, think about how the Greens might derail a minority Labor government. The Greens, for their part, have a vested interest in keeping the housing agenda alive. It has, after all, now become their major point of political attack.
Now Labor wants to come in and contribute yet again to the housing bubble.
How many times do we have to come to this place and hear this nonsense from the Greens?
We are in a very, very deep hole when it comes to this housing crisis, and it's going to take a lot to get us out of it.
The Australian people don't want to co-own their house with the government. The Australian dream is about people owning houses. It is not about the government co-owning their house. And I'm not sure that Mr Albanese is such a good landlord anyway.
But like every other bill we've brought to this place, every other plan we've brought to this place, it'll be subjected to meme after meme after meme, click after click after click, and no, 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 no.
The government had been clear that it was quite happy to have its signature bills blocked to highlight its political point, even letting speculation rip that it might consider a double dissolution election, despite the ludicrous timelines that now make such a spectre virtually impossible.
When the government puts forward half-baked ideas, we proudly vote against them. And frankly, I don't think the Prime Minister's threat of a double dissolution election is a credible one. That's the kind of threat that you make when you're 10 points up in the polls, not when you're behind in the polls.
But the Senate even frustrated the government's second best option of voting down its housing bills, instead voting to delay consideration of the legislation for 2 months. Others are also sharpening their attacks on the government as the pre-election positioning intensifies, everyone from business groups to the CFMEU. The PM heads to the Quad meeting in the United States tonight, a shift that brings international issues back into domestic political focus, amid criticisms of the government from both sides for Australia's decision to abstain from a vote on Palestine at the United Nations.
He's taken a decision which is not about our national interest. It's about winning votes in Western Sydney and trying to secure the position of Tony Burke and of Chris Bowen and others. And for that, I think he has really let our country down.
Adam Bandt is the leader of the Greens. He joined me earlier. Adam Bandt, welcome back to 7:30.
Hi, Laura.
What's wrong with a home equity scheme like the government's Help to Buy scheme?
Well, we put the government's bill through a pretty rigorous Senate inquiry, and what we found was this, that 99.8% of renters are locked out of this scheme. There's not places for them. What it will do for them, according to the economists who came before the Senate inquiry, is actually push up prices, because if you put more money into an already overheated housing market, it pushes up prices.
But the Greens offered the same sort of scheme at the last election. Why is it now no good? And as far as the sort of predictions of price rises are concerned, the Grattan Institute's predicting that the Labor measure would only increase house prices by 0.016% or $113 on a $700,000 home. Doesn't that suggest your scheme would have pushed prices up more? And why have you changed your mind on the idea?
Well, no, we haven't. And let's go to those 2 points. The Green scheme was to have the government build the homes and people come in and buy a share of them. They would be price controlled. So it's not the private market where prices keep going up. It was government built at an affordable rate, and if you wanted to sell it, you'd sell it back to the government. So it was let's get the government back into the business of building public housing, including in this instance where people could come in and buy a share of it. And so it was a very, very different scheme, and it was much broader. And if the government is now wanting to adopt Greens policy, then let's recall Parliament, we'll legislate that tomorrow, but that's not what's happening. But on the Grattan Institute point, all of the economists are saying it's going to push up house prices.
So to clarify your position about the government, a public government housing construction authority, is that your policy for the next election, and have you costed how much that would actually cost and how you would fund it?
Yes, we've been pushing for a public developer to get into the business again of getting government back into the business of building public homes. We put that out over 10 years, for example. You're looking at in the order of a total cost difference of about $27 billion because, of course, there's equity in this that the government gets to retain. Like government, this is what government used to do. Like the government's allocating $5 billion, I think, for this scheme that's in Parliament at the moment. Imagine how much public housing we could build for $5 billion, or we could fund a rent freeze or a cap on rent increases. We're saying there's better ways of spending the money. So
that would presumably be your major contribution on the supply side. But if we could just look at demand for a moment, the net migration figures are out today for the 12 months to March, and while they're down on the figures for the 12 months to December, they suggest there's zero chance that Treasury's forecast of net migration will be achieved this financial year. Should migration be cut back to ease demand on housing?
I don't accept the idea that's largely, I think, a political debate that's happening at the moment, led by Peter Dutton and unfortunately joined in by Labor, that is attempting to blame migrants for the housing crisis. Like, this is a pre-existing crisis.
It is a demand factor though, isn't it?
But I think there's the causes of this crisis, like we know what they are. There's a lack of building of public housing, and we've seen that over many years across all kinds of governments. Like, let's get on with building more public housing. But there's also these massive tax breaks that are going to wealthy property investors that are denying millions of renters the chance to buy their first home. $175 billion is what's going to these tax breaks, and that is pushing up house prices out of the reach of first home buyers.
Just talking about the actual legislation facing the Parliament, I'll ask you about the capital gains issue in a moment. To sum up your overall position on Labor's housing legislation, why, if they are such bad ideas, don't you just let them, why don't you just vote against them rather than just stalling them?
Because we'd prefer to do what we've done on previous legislation, which is negotiate, improve and pass. And we're prepared to, in the same way that we did with the housing fund legislation, where there wasn't a guaranteed spend and we secured a guaranteed spend, there wasn't enough money and we secured more money. We'd rather work with the government, pass some legislation, fix up some of the problems in the legislation, but it's got to sit side by side with other measures that will really tackle the housing crisis. And for us, those are three. It's a freeze and cap on rents, it's reining in the tax breaks, and it's building more public housing. So
you complain that the government isn't prepared to move, but what would your attitude be to a partial change by the government? For example, a prospective change in capital gains tax treatment of investment properties. Would you be prepared to also make some accommodations on a partial move like that?
Yes, we would. And I mean, capital gains tax concessions are a big part of the reason that so many renters and first home buyers are getting locked out at the moment. And I think it would be an incredibly popular move for Anthony Albanese to work with the Greens to rein them in. And look, he changed his mind, to his credit, on stage 3 tax cuts and said the situation is now much worse than before the election, and instead said this is what we're going to do instead. The housing and rental crisis is now much worse than it was even 2 years ago. And if the government, look, if they want to have the discussion about we'll rein in this unfair tax handout but not that one, or we want to phase it in, then of course we're going to come to that discussion in good faith, because that would be a good thing for renters and stressed mortgage holders.
Sure. Well, here's a place where compromise does seem possible: the proposed reforms to the Reserve Bank Act. Can I confirm that your only condition on the reform bill itself is that the government retains Section 11 of the Reserve Bank Act, which gives the government the reserve power to direct the central bank in extreme circumstances?
Well, there's a couple of matters on that. The Greens want to see interest rates cut. The Reserve Bank hiking interest rates is smashing mortgage holders, and part of the problem is that it's being done in coordination with Labor, who is in fact leaving all of the heavy lifting up to the Reserve Bank.
Let's concentrate on the Reserve Bank Act.
Yeah, so but I guess I'm saying it's part of you've got to take a different approach, I guess, rather than let the Reserve Bank do it all. So do that, tackle the massive price rises, look at the massive profits the big corporations are making that is driving this, and then cut interest rates. But to do it, you've got to have the power in the legislation to do it. That's there at the moment, and the Treasurer is trying to give it up.
But if the Treasurer agrees not to give it up and leave the Act as it was, you wouldn't have a problem with the rest of the reforms to the Reserve Bank?
Well, that's certainly one of the key things that we'll be asking the government. More broadly, we're asking the government how it is that they're going to ensure that interest rates are cut for stressed mortgage holders at the moment. We want a different approach, the government, to tackling the inflation crisis, one that doesn't use everyday people and stressed mortgage holders as cannon fodder.
Sure. The US Federal Reserve has made its biggest single cut in interest rates in 16 years overnight. Should Jim Chalmers be using that existing power to direct the central bank to also cut?
Yes. People just can't take anymore. People can't take anymore. And when Jim Chalmers says the Reserve Bank is smashing the economy, what that actually means is it's smashing mortgage holders, because they're the ones who are bearing the brunt of this. The thing is, he can do something about it, and it should be done in concert with those other measures that I outlined. I think Australia would be a much better place if we said, in a cost of living crisis, we're not going to allow supermarkets to price gouge on essentials. We're not going to allow big corporations to keep pushing up the price of bills and banks to make massive profits, and instead we're going to regulate it a bit.
Adam Bandt, we're out of time, but thanks for yours tonight.
Thanks very much, Laura.